Hi everyone, my name is Christel Allen. I work as NARAL Pro-Choice Oregon's political director. Thank you. I am here with literally just, I feel like we're the Avengers, but I need a better name. But just an amazing team that I was so lucky to be a part of. And in 2018, we did some amazing things that we're going to talk about. Before we introduce everyone, I want to just recognize a couple quick things. We want to do a shout out to Chelsea Jennings. And while I am the person who helped put together the bulk of this information, it was mostly Chelsea who did, I would say, more than her share of the half. And we are lucky enough to be presenting this information, and thank you, Chelsea. Chelsea Jennings works at Planned Parenthood Advocacy of Oregon and Eugene, does amazing work, and was the field director of the Measure 106 campaign. I also no cuts to care campaign. No 106. We also want to give a lot of credit to Courtney Graham, who, if you don't know her, she is an amazing campaign manager. She ran our campaign with 3 months and did an amazing job. We're going to talk about all of the things she helped do. And we also want to share the unfortunate news that Representative Rachel Prusak, who was really excited to join us, actually has a stomach bug. So that's housekeeping. Again, my name is Christel. I work with NARAL, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And we're going to be introducing everyone by saying your favorite thing about 2018 and the work we did. And mine was literally just getting to know every single person that I'm here up with. And on that note,
my name is Anne, she, her pronouns. I am the political director for Planned Parenthood Advocates of Oregon. Aside from being able to sit at the table with all of these amazing individuals and organizations, one of my favorite things was really being able to center the voices of folks most impacted, being able to elevate the voices of folks who were on OHP and able to get abortion care and what that meant for them in their lives. And my other favorite part was literally saying all the time, abortion is healthcare. And just being able to lead with that message was really phenomenal, and I was really proud to be able to be a part of that.
Hi everybody, thank you for being here. My name is Michele Ruffin. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Oregon Advocacy Director with Forward Together. We're a women of color-led organization. We've been working on reproductive justice for over 30 years. And I think my favorite thing about the 2018 campaign really was like meeting so many young people who had never been a part of the work, bringing them into the paid canvas or into just volunteer canvas, and like teaching folks about why we bring people into the movement, and not just about these are the numbers, these are the doors, these are the messages, and you gotta win, but like bringing people into the movement and actually sharing, allowing people to develop their own stories around abortion access, and seeing people develop under that scope. It was just really cool. So that was like the heart and soul for me.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nguyen. I am on staff with APANO. We are a statewide policy advocacy organization fighting on social justice for Asian Pacific Islanders. And she, her, hers. My highlight for 2018 was probably the moment of election night where Oregonian had our back, because it was a really tough anti-immigrant, anti-choice. And concurrently, a lesser-known project was the administration signed a family separation, the zero-tolerance policy that affected 123 detained folks that identified as South Asian. And in 1990, I came here to America in the very same way, seeking political asylum, and I was met with open arms, and I was put through, I'm a proud product of public school system all the way through college, and to see in 2019 the total opposite and being able to fight, and then standing on the stage with these very women the moment we found out that Oregon protected our sense of community and said, not on our watch. So.
Yes.
So we're going to do a little bit of a level set. Times are a little grim nationally, to put it lightly, right? So since 2010 and when we had redistricting, we've really seen how track laws, abortion regulation laws have been sweeping through the country. And certainly since this administration has been placed into office, we've just seen a mounting campaign to chip away at reproductive rights. So currently 90% of US counties lack an abortion provider. There are 6 states where there's only 1 abortion provider. This past summer, you probably heard a ton about Title X, which is basically the Trump administration, through rulemaking, trying to dismantle a decades-long family planning program. And effectively, the crux of it is that the Health and Human Services Administration is trying to gag providers, basically saying you are not allowed to discuss or refer abortion care to your patients when you're talking and counseling them about all of their pregnancy options. This effectively means that the patients that come to Planned Parenthood, Title X patients that are seen at Planned Parenthood, we as like a provider would not be able to bill Title X for those services. So effectively cutting Planned Parenthood out of the Title X program. Most recently this October, the Supreme Court announced that they would be hearing the Louisiana Act 620 case. It's an abortion restriction case that basically directly mirrors one that they had already heard about 3 years ago. That was Whole Women's Health versus Helsted, a Texas abortion restriction case that they struck down. So basically, in agreeing to review the Louisiana case, they're reviewing their own decision from 2016. And this is something that after the appointment of Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, and with all of the abortion bans that we've seen pass in this past year, of which there have been 26, that we're really looking at what does it look like when Roe gets challenged at the Supreme Court? What does that look like on a national landscape to chip away at Roe and basically overturn the protection that it has for individuals across this nation? If Roe was gutted, over 25 million people of reproductive age would be effectively banned from being able to access abortion care. That is an immense number. These sustained and extreme attacks on reproductive rights have already negatively impacting our communities. We have whole swaths of folks who are unable to access abortion care because of the Hyde Amendment. So we already know that access to abortion, both through geographical barriers and also financial barriers, is real. And now we're also looking at a landscape in which the laws are shifting against us. But here in Oregon, we have been leading the way in the fight for abortion rights. Over the past 10 years, we've made substantial strides in protecting and expanding access to abortion and reproductive health care services. We are the only state in the country with no restrictions on access to abortion. We are one of 17 states that has abortion as part of Medicaid coverage, which is what we're going to get into that we defended last fall. And then in 2017, the Pro-Choice Coalition of Oregon helped pass the Reproductive Health Equity Act, which really substantially expanded the coverage for reproductive health care services at no out-of-pocket cost for Oregonians who had state-regulated commercial health care plans. In addition to that, it wrote into law that you couldn't discriminate based on gender identity on those commercial health plans, and also established reproductive health coverage for undocumented Oregonians. Furthermore, we codified the right to an abortion in Oregon and that law. So we've done really amazing things in Oregon, but it is far from settled here. This past legislative cycle, we saw 11 anti-abortion bills be introduced into our state legislature, and we're not immune from the federal landscape as well, right? So the federal policies, the rescinding of funding really impacts patients that are trying to get care in Oregon. And what we know is that we have to work in Oregon to be able to maintain access to care, expand access to care, and protect that right, because we are going to be serving not just Oregonians, but folks from other states as well. And we already know that folks come to Oregon in order to get the care that they need because access is so endangered, detrimental, non-existent in other places as well.
Okay, so get ready for your boos and hisses. This is a dialogue. So just last year, one of Oregon's own anti-choice group, Oregon Life United, successfully put the Measure 106 on our November 2018 ballot. Since 2012, these anti-abortion extremists worked to put a measure that would cut access to care for low-income and public service workers. They called it Stop Taxpayer Funding for Abortion Act of 2018. and that would have amended the Constitution to prohibit spending public funds for abortion. Measure 106 was a backdoor ban on abortion, and we told voters just that. The No Cuts to Care, no on Measure 106 campaign was an abortion-forward campaign that we lead with our values, and we won big because of it. We started and continue to use the message of reproductive freedom, but then through research, our data showed that we could absolutely use the term abortion and not shy away from it, even on our lawn signs.
And we won big. I believe the technical term for this is crushed it. We crushed it. 64%. We won by 64%. Not only that, no on Measure 106 was the top vote getter in 2018. About 1,914,000 votes were cast. Of those, 1.1 million were no votes on 106. More people voted on 106 than any other ballot measure in our state's history, and it was the top vote getter of any ballot measure or any candidate on the 2018 ballot. This issue motivates voters. It's something that people are really passionate about because it so intimately impacts their lives. We won by a larger margin than we expected, and that is because of the choices and investments that this campaign made, and we're really excited to share some of that with you today.
Yes, thank you for setting that up, Anne. We absolutely made some different choices, and we were really, some of these choices came out like 3 months ahead of election day, right? We were really in a time crunch. So I guess one of the things I'll highlight is that as we moved into the campaign, right, we were working off of some multiple strengths from the beginning. One of our greatest assets was that we had infrastructure from the prior, winning prior legislation around the Reproductive Health Equity Act. Yay. So that we could have some folks really invested in shifting and moving into a fight. I think, and that's despite a lot of the leadership transitions that were happening at different organizations, right? So having that, and I think there was some exciting elements of the campaign, like how we were able to engage unions, because it was going to affect them too, right? Over 170,000 folks who had union plans were actually going to be affected if this passed. So we were able to engage nurses, SEIU members, so many folks who came onto the campaign and hit hard with us. We also, I think, the biggest thing that we still talk about all the time is that we really made different choices. As partners around the table, I think we were most successful in the campaign when we made sure that everybody we wanted could be at the table that we wanted, and what it looked like was really important to us. So I think there's this conversation that we really want to highlight and have about the pay-to-play model that we use for campaigns, for setting up campaigns, and how that can be really inequitable because it doesn't actually allow, like, if you need somebody to drop a certain amount of money to be part of a campaign like this, it actually doesn't build leadership among everybody. And so it's really important. Like, I feel like the thing that we did most is really just kill the pay-to-play model, right? We decided to make a totally different choice and say, we want who we want at the table, and we're still gonna raise $3 million, and that's just how we get it done. So it was really cool, and I think the next thing I guess I'll just give another shout out to Courtney Graham. Because Courtney Graham really helped to move some of that stuff forward. I know she's not here, but she, I sat next to her for 3.5 months on the campaign while I was running the canvas, and there is nobody who works like Courtney Graham does. She's the shit. So I just want to give a real shout out to her because her leadership was really important in the campaign. So that said, as with any campaign, tensions come up. So like, what did we do from the outset? We were about 3.5 months out. They come up naturally, especially around decision making. And so we wanted to lead with our values, and I think we've got all these values like set out, but really what this was is, I guess I'll say from Forward Together's perspective, right, we've been at multiple ballot measure tables in California and New Mexico around reproductive freedom, and we pushed for a really early conversation with the executive committee and our consultants about what our shared values and approach will be for the campaign. And this looked like, I mean, it was like a 5-hour day. Everybody sat together in a room, and it was just a serious commitment of resources for a campaign that was just three months out from election day. That, you know, most people are like, we're 3 months out. What are we doing sitting in a room for 5 hours talking about our values? Well, this was a really important way to set up the foundations for the campaign. So even though the campaign clock started mid-July, right, the executive committee really prioritized the conversation, and it really led to this sort of guiding set of principles for the campaign that would lead all of the decision making. So this is another like great way that I think we set out our values.
And I'll continue with that. One of the unique elements of this campaign was that our investments in communities of color. We know that women of color are disproportionately affected and are also overwhelmingly pro-choice. But given the late campaign, we knew that it was going to take or have a limited field program, and the fact that traditional ballot measure of focus is likely on voters, it would have to be easy for communities of color to that would easily fall out of a campaign's target demographics. We made a different choice for the Measure 106 campaign. Our work was to engage communities of color through field work led by Forward Together and APANO, through our mail and radio to reach the Latinx and API voters.
So we've kind of alluded to different decisions were made, and I would want to say that even in the pre-qualification process, when I think Michele and myself and Laurel Swerdlow and Grayson were just watching like all of these signatures be gathered and just figuring out what could we do right now. And one of the earliest decisions a campaign can make is investing in polling. And what I would just say is we made a conscious decision to do an oversample of Latinx voters in Oregon because we knew that for all the reasons said, this was a population where there was a lot of opportunity, but unless we had invested in that research, we wouldn't be able to build the type of campaign that was actually inclusive unless we started out doing that work. It was literally one of the first decisions us as a campaign ultimately made, and that foundation of a good decision, it sort of paved the way for all of the good decisions that came as a result. And what we learned is really like, there was a huge opportunity, and this was going to be a fundamental piece of our campaign because the data showed, and just a couple things I want to highlight, Latina voters in Oregon opposed Measure 106 by a 31-point margin. It was one of the biggest margins we saw, and we just realized like unless we really develop the messages that are going to motivate these voters to care, and the good news is we learned these issues and 105, those matter so much to the populations we were seeking to target, and it paid off. API, Asian and Pacific Islanders, we saw oppose this ban by a 20-point margin, which is really significant. And when I was mentioning that we needed to do this research and why it was so important, is what we actually saw was we saw the huge opportunity because they, Latinx voters, API voters, they opposed Measure 106 by the same margins as likely voters, which is who we usually just poll leading up to these things. But we found that the messages that really resonated were different. And so to do this right, we really needed to develop messages that were different. Here's a couple interesting things we learned. Here are the messages that really resonated, and they're in the order with Latinx voters of which was the most compelling and what they found most concerning about IP1 that ultimately became Measure 106. In gray, you'll see that this is the order of the full, likely voters, and you can see that they're very different. We actually had a message that didn't really push through, but you know, Latinx voters really care about like this tradition. They really care about who our state is as values, and so that was really, really interesting. And we'll get to it in a second, my colleagues, but we knew that we had to include these messages to this audience, and I'm kind of excited for you guys to see the results. The other thing we learned when it came to most effective messages, for Latinx voters, these are the ones that really came through. They're very similar to what we all care about, but it really, the emphasis on families, the emphasis on giving families what they need. This is a community that really cares about their families and their community. And we put that into our messaging. And the other thing I would say is, when it came to all likely voters, we had 3 messages that really came through. We only had 2 messages that came through of the polling messages we tested. I think this reflects that much more research is needed and much more cultural specific messaging research is needed. And so we just didn't test the messages to find what that message triangle, which is kind of of campaign strategies, is what you ideally look for, which just shows more opportunity as we move forward. Speaking of opportunities.
Yes, okay, I always love seeing this picture, these lovely people. So Forward Together, really in tandem with the No on 106 campaign, we ran our own Deep Canvas program, where we hired and trained our own folks. We really helped to integrate a lot of the messages that Anne was helping develop on the communications team, and really moving that into taking all of the research that we've done and moving that into a data-driven campaign. And I think, one of the things that, what it looked like was about a little over a 50K in-kind investment in the campaign, right? We weren't just integrated, we were really trying to get at building relationships with voters of color and running it through a team that was at least 50% folks of color at all times, so that we can take the intentional steps to make sure that folks were reflected. So we used the deep engagement model in our canvassing to talk to folks about abortion at the door. On the door, we started with a question about support for abortion as a personal decision between Oregonians, their families, and their doctors without government intervention. I think for a lot of our communities and communities of color, right, you can't always you gotta start the conversation really intentionally about decision making, because ultimately that's what it's about. And bringing people into the conversation who maybe care about pre or postpartum care, or whatever that may look like. Folks care about making their own decisions. And that's very true for abortion. So when we started talking to folks, we asked them some key questions about that. We asked people where they were, and based on where they identified on this 1 to 5 scale, we trained our team to then move to either talking about Measure 106 and the danger that it presented, or talking to folks about their own personal story, so that people could engage person to person and not just read off some talking points and then ask for a yes or no answer at the end of that conversation. So, and it worked, right? There were so many people who we came back a second or third time, and folks were like, I remember you, your name's Brian, right? Like, people would be like, I do remember you, and they were so much more trusting and so much more willing to talk about their stories, or to talk about giving their ballots, or to talk about voting. And for us, I think the takeaway was building some serious relationships is important at the door. Talking points are talking points, but like, if you want to connect with folks, especially in communities of color, we got to really invest. So we knocked over 16,000 doors. 1263 is the number I used. That was the amount of voters that we really got folks to pledge and then follow up. The program operated from about mid-September all the way through Election Day. So I'll pause it. And then I think, that's right. So data-driven. I was just talking about data-driven stuff. So what did we did some analysis, right, based on, we're a multiracial, multi-issue organization. So at the door, when we talked to you and asked you to sign a pledge, we also asked folks for demographic data, right? And they filled out their race, gender, and sexuality, and so we were able to gather some data around that. And so this just it gives you a little sense of like, what was the difference in performance? And at the end of the day, it's broken down by race, right? African American folks who were canvassed by Forward Together turned out 68% versus folks who we hadn't talked to at about 56%. This is a 12% difference. So like, we broke it down by race, and just seeing some of this, and on average, it's about a 12% difference in performance.
So you really feel this was valuable and meaningful for the long term?
100%. We're going to talk about that a little more. Yeah.
Thanks, Michele. So from APANO's perspective, our role was to unite the No on Measure 105 and the Measure 106. We also have a C4, so that also meant that we were able to go for the gubernatorial race as well. So what we did was, and in the 2018 cycle, we had 35,000 dials, we knocked 3,000 doors, we held, and that's covered from 14 campuses. We had 8 phone banks, dozens of outreach events. But what we ensured was that each door, we had language capacity of at least 2. So we paired folks up. And each of our phone banks averaged 9 languages. Wow. We partnered with organizations that didn't have the language capacity and turned our office into that language assistance for our partner and our allies. And my favorite moment probably, one of my vote fellows took a picture because I literally was one of the few Vietnamese phone bankers that night, and I had 2 different voters on both hands, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna actually be speaking to both of you. I can't conference call you in because we were using robo-dialers, right? So just bear with me if this other person has a question. But what I can share with you is that through the dialogue, even with as much research and testing and messaging, right, I didn't realize that the translation services that we did, it wasn't resonating until I was on the phones. And they were telling me they didn't have to reckon the matters of choice unless it's tied to their immigrant story. So personally, for example, you heard earlier, I said I came here in 1990 with my folks. We came via a refugee camp in Thailand. My mom had to make a very difficult position because she realized that while we were in that refugee camp, she was pregnant. And that would have just started the process all over, not just affect me, my brother, my dad, and she. It would have affected the other 13 family members whose immigration portfolio was there. So she had to make that tough choice. So she, being a good Catholic Vietnamese woman, I was hearing the story time and time again. And so quickly, kudos here to Amy out in the audience, but we were able to pivot messaging. We had our staff with community development who deals with the shorter ARF intent type work, which they deal with transportation, housing, etc. But they monitored in-language media for us and realized that one of the Vietnamese publications was running pro-Trump, anti-choice ads. So we quickly responded with our own No on Measure 106, No Cuts to Care messaging, and then also quickly partnered with Catholics for Choice and did a Facebook ad. And immediately squashed all the things, all of the misinformation and distruths that they were putting out there, so.
Yeah.
Wow. So we also, in addition to what she just outlined in terms of investments that we made in the API community, we had a really remarkable opportunity to be able to identify in our research among Latinx voters in the Mid-Willamette Valley, and we had part of building a great coalition. And I think to your point about resources, it's about what are the groups that you're bringing to your table that you can also lean on for in-language translation, for outreach into these communities, because they are also the folks who should be talking to these communities, right? So our coalition had really amazing different organizations of color that we were able to, and had strong relationships with the different executive directors and organizers in those organizations of color, and we were able to work with them and with UFW co-founder Dolores Huerta to put together radio ads and a mailer that we were able to send targeted mail pieces to 23,000 Latinx households in 5 key counties, and then also run 480 radio ads in English and in Spanish in 7 Spanish language radio stations. And so when we're looking at the total investment that the campaign had, it was about over 30,000 in communications to communities of color, not including digital advertising or the phenomenal in-kind work that APANO and Forward Together did in their field program. But it paid off in spades. And what I want to do here is pause and say that if we are really invested in building a more equitable and more representative body of government, we have to invest in communities of color. We have to invest and shift the narrative away from just talking about high propensity voters and talking about why are these voters not engaged right now. It's because they've never seen themselves reflected in the government that is making choices for them. If it's because no one's knocked on their doors or made calls to their houses, it's because they've been systematically cut out of talking about these issues. So if we are committed to meeting this changing electorate and empowering those voices, we need to make these investments. And we need to make these investments and change what our idea of that win is to be able to make long-term transformational change. And then we all as a group and as a party need to be able to do that work. And I think that we were able to do that work in Measure 106, and I think that it really showcased that we could win while leading with our values and implementing these values. So when we did a survey after the election, before the survey in September, only 43% of Latinx voters opposed Measure 106. After the election, 75% reported voting no. Voters of color were twice as likely to recall seeing no ads online or having seen a mail piece. So when we were doing polling, we were at 54% roughly, right? We were like, okay, the whole campaign. We were like 54% that we think that's gonna be our win. We won by 10 points more. What this says to me is that our investment into communities of color, our targeted investments in really looking at who we want to talk to in a deep way about these issues blew away our margin. 64% of Oregonians voted against this, and when we followed up with the oversample on Latinx populations, that tracked. That investment really moved voters. And we knew that our issue was going to bring out the vote for all the other progressive issues, including the governor's campaign. And so when we're talking about this investment on this specific issue, we're also talking about how this specific issue impacts a lot of other progressive issues on the ballot. So I'm just gonna really, again and again, say that these investments into communities of color, following people of color in doing this work is not only a winning strategy for an election, but if we're gonna live our values and commit to transformational change, it's what we have to do.
And that message has been made consistently throughout this weekend.
Yeah.
So I alluded to sort of connecting with candidates, right? So we knew that choice was going to be a really big issue in this particular. Oh yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So we're all about sharing best practices and really innovative approaches, right? This is another one of those things. But before I left out, while we had canvassing and phone banking for the API community, we made sure to feed our people and provide childcare. So don't want to leave that out. But another really, and here's a secret. Are you ready for this? You know how I moved to the US when I was 8? By the time I was 10, oftentimes during election season, I was sitting there with all 10 ballots for my family members because I was the only English proficient enough person to explain to them who to vote for. And let's be real here, unless a candidate looks like somebody that allows them the innate just trust, they're not excited. They care more about the issues. And so oftentimes I will then explain the issues and then say, oh, and by the way, these people are good on those things. And then they go, oh yeah. So anyways, and I cannot take any credit for this, but my political director, Ruffin, he convinced us 6 days leading up to the final vote count to turn our office into a ballot assistance center. So let me tell you the same story. During a phone bank, Todd, one of our community development director, got on the phone with a Cantonese speaking woman. She was so he raised his hand, we had our Cantonese staff come over, May Yi took the line, and literally the auntie was like, tell me straight down the line how to vote. So May Yi's explaining, right, exact same thing that I had lived, our staff is doing for someone else now as a trusted ambassador and advisor. And then when we turned our office into the ballot assistance, because she lives in HUD housing, predominantly API, low-income folks, we were able to send J-Raj, our field team, to go collect their batch of the ballots and was able to return it to the ballot assistants, and then we ran it into the elections office. So, again, I can't speak more about the early investment, because I think what readied our organization, even in our time of change, little known fact, I don't know how much you know of APANO, but we had gone through an executive leadership change, and resources were tight, right? Like, I walked into an org that was extremely tight, and then to get the call, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I don't have much to offer, much less a check to write to you, but I'll do what I can. I'll give. That's the immigrant way. We're not shying away from the sweat equity, right? But the early investment from Team Oregon allowed me and readied my translation staff in-house. It was Team Oregon PAC that got me to do the candidate in-language lit, that then when 105 and 106 came along, we already had it built. So then we just said, okay, go ahead and turn these messaging over into Vietnamese, Korean. So we actually cranked out 7 languages of lit drop opportunities.
So to sort of continue this thread, we knew that choice was going to be a central issue to both candidates, and they were trying to sort of delineate themselves within this central issue. So you had Newt Buehler, who's the Republican candidate, describing himself as pro-choice, and for months during that race, they were sort of going back and forth about like, I'm pro-choice, you're faux choice, having folks really question what it meant to be pro-choice, right? And when we knew that this was going to be like a central issue, 106 became a campaign that didn't want to get pulled into a tug of war with the candidates, but we also had many of our our allies in the coalition who had PACs who had endorsed Governor Brown. And we knew that this would be a really key issue for her campaign, to be able to bring out her voters as well. So we made, the governor's campaign made a choice to make it a priority, and they even included specific lit that was talking specifically about Measure 106, as well as her Reproductive Health Equity Act champion, as like really defining her as the candidate who was pro-choice, who actually really cared about reproductive health in a way that translated to access on a financial level, on an insured level. We thought, and our hunch was correct, that Measure 106 would drive out the vote. And the data on our post-election poll suggests that Measure 106 could have ripple effects that benefited other progressive campaigns. It was a very close race. I think we all were sort of on tenterhooks for much of fall, looking at the margins between Governor Brown and Newt Buehler. And then at the end of the day, she ended up winning by 6 points. 94% of her voters opposed Measure 106. And most of them, 59%, correctly identified her as an opponent to the measure. But most critically though, among the voters who saw Measure 106 as the most important item on the ballot, she won 56% to 44%. So that was a really motivating issue for them, and when they turned up for that issue on the ballot, they turned up for Governor Brown on the ballot as well. And that was a better margin than she received from the other like high ticket, like really high priority ballot measures, including Measure 105 and Measure 103, the ban on the grocery sales tax.
So as Anne was saying, this was a very, very unique, So this was a very, very unique landscape. There's never been an election where we were running directly after the passage of like some historic landmark legislation like the Reproductive Health Equity Act. And I would say literally as a result, there was renewed energy from our opponents to begin collecting ballots to defund Oregon Health Plan. In addition to the new population we decided to pass, and that included undocumented Oregonians. That was actually one of their biggest messaging points, is that we're providing services to people who aren't citizens, and honestly, like we were a little nervous about how Oregonians would feel about that. It turns out we really, as a state, want to be there for each other, and yet, like, we knew that it was just such an interesting year. 106 was qualifying. We had just passed this wonderful thing and immediately turned into our opposition's fire to qualify for the first time after 3 failed attempts. And we knew that we had, our organization, Planned Parenthood, we had a PAC And so that allowed us to make this direct connection. I think all of our organizations played really interesting roles, and this is where we knew we could be that link between our issue and candidates, and we knew if they ran on our issue, they were gonna win. But we needed some new messages because no one had ever seen an election year quite like ours with so many interesting things at hand. So what NARAL did was work with our partners at the National Institute for Reproductive Health Action Fund. We did a strategies poll, and we had at the same time this new type of Republican opponent for a lot of our races, what we literally called a faux choice Republican. And that required learning, like, how do we talk to voters about that? This is what we found, and we are happy to provide this if you want to dig in deep. But these were similar messages to what we saw with 106, but we really we had to tell candidates, hey, abortion's on lawn signs. You can say the word abortion at the doors. People are going to talk about it, and they want us to when Kavanaugh's battle is happening, when that is putting Roe versus Wade under threat. Like, they want to hear from you that you are on their side and you are going to do what we can to hold the line in Oregon. We had to basically update our definition of what pro-choice means in Oregon, and we did that by working with some tremendous candidates. And so these are some examples from those messages I just showed of how we put that into messages. Here you have Janelle Bynum. You have a mailer where you're featuring trusted organizations on these issues like Planned Parenthood and NARAL, and you're talking about that connection to the legislature. These are the messages that polled really well. What also polled well was like distinguishing our candidates from these new types of faux choice Republicans. I think the one who got the most attention and spent a ton of money was Newt Bueller. And we had real things to point to. Voters were down to have the discussion. When we explained that he voted no on the Reproductive Health Equity Act, that's what they needed. They were really excited that we were sharing that information. And then when he kept saying, I'm pro-choice, people knew not to believe that. We wanted to feature like our basically like type A, like example of literally someone who led so fiercely with her values. Representative Prusak, again, regrets that she can't be here. She can't back away from these issues. She is a former nurse at Planned Parenthood, so that was going to be something she talked about with voters. And she was running against a candidate who many of you know, and someone who, again, was telling voters she was pro-choice even though she voted against the Reproductive Health Equity Act. And so this was just literally the most stark example of what we were telling candidates through our toolkits, through $50,000, $75,000 that NARAL put into candidate campaigns. And we put it in through mailers and social media using these messages that worked. And then we're going to talk about, and we won, and candidates won. We have super majorities. We have, thank goodness, Kate Brown in the governor's seat for 4 more years. But the work has not stopped, and so I'm going to let Ann talk a little bit about what we're seeing now.
So Oregon has pretty spectacular comprehensive sex education laws, but implementation is tricky. It's an unfunded mandate, and so there are very limited resources. What we've seen is as school districts are trying to pass sex ed plans, and school boards are talking about this, that there's been a real targeted attack on specifically trans and gender nonconforming students. So part of the curricula includes the requirement to have gender identity be covered. And I think that we can talk about how important it is for the curricula that our students are receiving, particularly around their health and healthy relationships, to be reflective of who they are and like what their real lived experiences are. So we were able to, so as this issue has been coming up for school boards and they're voting on it, and there's some like a very vocal minority of folks coming out and specifically targeting trans and gender nonconforming students in that portion of the curricula. We also see our state representatives stepping up to talk about why these issues are important and why these school districts should, in compliance with the law, be passing curricula that covers all of these issues. And so you can see here that Representative Rachel Prusak and Representative Courtney Nguyen, both as nurses and teachers, were able to come and lend their support. And I think that, again, this is just showcasing that we should be able to lead with our values and like lead with what is at the heart of why we're doing all of this work, right? And I think that that is really key in terms of all of the issues intersecting with reproductive health, including sex ed. So we just wanted to really, in terms of like this value statement that I know we've been banging on about for a while, but we as a campaign, in addition to making choices around messaging and polling and investments, really made choices around our staffing too. The campaign was an opportunity to bring a diverse staff from many different professional and personal backgrounds, and including the opportunity to extend this these jobs and this development to people who are newer to campaigns and to politics, as a way to cultivate, develop, and train new people into the movement. And that carried over after the campaign as well. So we had folks who were new to politics who were part of this campaign, and the campaign was really invested in bringing those diverse voices into stable jobs. So all of our campaign staff were hired into full-time positions into different organizations that were at the coalition table, or even went on to be staffers for in the state legislature. And that is like, these are folks of color. These are folks who had like previously not been in politics, and this is movement building, right? This is when you look at equity and you want to do the walk, it's about hiring folks, it's about training them, it's about developing them, and it's about pushing them up that ladder of engagement into leadership roles down the line. And I think we were really proud to be able to do that work in our campaign in the way that we staffed. And we also really wanted our volunteer experience to be transformational rather than transactional. So we devoted a lot of time and resources into training our volunteers who were door knocking, doing debriefs with them. And we saw time and time again, they would come back, not just because they were really passionate about the issue, but because there was a connection to the campaign itself. And wanting to be able to give that transformational rather than like, thanks for knocking on the door, here's some pizza, bye, thing. And I think that that was a value that we held and was great to be able to do.
So for our last slide, before we will turn this over to questions, I'm very excited that we gave you an inside look of what we did in Oregon, but I also want to say we cannot take credit for this work. This movement that we are talking about and how we're doing things differently was built by Black women. And I want to really make space for that and end on what I think would be the most important thing, is just reminding everyone what reproductive justice, it's a term you might hear a lot, and you may be wondering, what is that? Like, how is that different than the pro-choice movement? And I feel like this quote really sticks with me, and it best explains, and it's by Monica Simpson, who is the executive director of an amazing organization called Sister Song. This organization started 25 years ago, and we can literally trace back, even though this work has been happening in communities of color for decades, it was 25 years ago that we put a name on it. And I just want to take a moment to recognize that moment when a group of Black women gathered together to discuss the unique needs of women of color and for women that were not being addressed by the pro-choice movement. These issues for decades and decades and decades had been framed by the interest of middle class and wealthy white women. And by contrast, this group was pushing for an intersectional approach to reproductive health care. And these women drafted a statement, which I would invite you to look up and read. It was just posted in the Washington Post this summer. They drafted a statement, they addressed it to all members of Congress, they collected more than 800 signatures, and then they published the statement with full-page ads on August 16, 1994, so about 25 years ago. And in doing so, they really created this movement. Everything we mentioned about all these different choices, we really cannot take credit for. This roadmap was paved by the work of Black women, and it's so important, and we need to do it justice today by just continuing that legacy. And so I just want to make sure we're ending and giving credit to where credit's due, because I think it's the most important thing. Our movement has realized that we're doing this work in fundamentally different ways, and the great news is we're we're also kicking ass. So on that, I will open it to questions, and since it's a small group, let me know if you need to use the mic, but I think we don't. So, and if you could say your name.
Sure, Shannon Core, I live in Polk County.
I think we need to use the mic so the folks that are live streaming, so I'll
Thank you, Chelsea.
Shannon Core, I live in Polk County. This is primarily to NARAL and Planned Parenthood, but I know she is a mom in Salem Kaiser, so I want your opinion on this too. Salem Kaiser School District, second largest school district in the state. With the exception of one board member, is entirely bought and paid for by Working Right to Life.
Yep.
How do we leverage what you've learned in this NOAA 106 campaign to change that?
Well, I think there are a few things. I think there's some structural problems in the Salem Kaiser sort of school board makeup in terms of elections. So Cocoon ran a bill this past legislative session that's really amazing. It's the Oregon Voting Rights Act, and what it is looking at large districts, right? So when you have folks in at-large districts, that means that your community can have somebody else's community voting for your representative. So one of the key structural pieces is addressing that. Is addressing how you can have communities of color and then have the person who's representing that community look completely different and be voted in by another group that is has nothing to do with that community. So that groundbreaking work that Cocoon is doing, I think, is part of this narrative. I think also it is just that do you want to speak to Oregon Right to Life?
So, two things. Oregon Right to Life uses a lot of tactics that I think we need to be more vigilant in actually filing complaints on. They ran some very misleading internet ads, so that if you searched "where's my ballot box," you actually got their page of endorsed school board members this last election. They also funded a women's leadership fund that put their candidates on, and it was interestingly, if you look at their board, it's mostly white men. And also funded just by Oregon Right to Life, but definitely looking like a mailer that one of our organizations would send out with our list of endorsements. So I would say conversations with Cocoon, who is one of our strongest partners, who does amazing work in Salem Kaiser. We wanted to show up this year. I feel like we can always do more and will do more, but we've continued to have conversations afterwards, because I think one thing we've recognized is we have pro-choice voters who also may not be great at understanding these issues with a racial lens. And that's on us to do a better job at educating and organizing our allies in this fight.
Organizationally, obviously capacity is always a concern. So if we have the resources, being that we're Portland-based org, but we are statewide, my dream would be that, the magic that was happening at our canvassing and phone bank nights, we have organizations that are down south, Mid-Willamette Valley, reaching up to us and saying, hey, could you maybe send 3 language capacities? We could have shared, right, and then spread that wealth around the state more.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being on the panel. I am a big supporter of Planned Parenthood and abortion access, and I've been a volunteer in Planned Parenthood leadership advocacy team in Washington County. And there's some stuff happening in Washington County, and with relation to school boards. And anybody that was at the breakfast this morning, Senator Wagner talked about a pro-choice progressive school board caucus that's going on. Can you, for folks that do know about that, can you elaborate on that? Because our school boards are under attack, and now we're on the defense. And so I want to know what's going on with that.
Grayson, can you take this? I feel like you it's something that really Grayson was it's her baby.
In addition to my other babies. No, thank you, and I feel honored to take the mic. This is such an amazing panel, and I say that with absolutely no bias. You guys are making me cry with your amazingness. Senator Wagner was referencing the School Board Members for Reproductive Health Network that we have started with his leadership, Representative Diego Hernandez, who's also a school board member. And one of the things that we realized after we endorsed in school board races for the first time in 2017 was that it wasn't enough to just endorse, that a lot of school board members really need support once they get into office. We know that often school board members are new elected officials. Many of them, it's majority women, they're volunteers, and they may not come with, they definitely don't come with the resources and support that you get if you're getting elected to the legislature, right? We found that even just trying to research these races took a ton of time because there's not a central place for information sharing. And so one of the things that happened in 2017 after we endorsed in school board races was that Senator Wagner, well at the time school board member Rob Wagner, went to the Oregon School Board Association conference and the question was asked, who's new in the room? And 50% of people raised their hands. And what we realized as we started seeing those attacks coming in Salem-Keizer, in Hillsborough, in Westland-Wilsonville, was that school board members didn't know how to connect with one another. They didn't know how to draw the support that they needed from their communities, and they didn't have the capacity to be doing best policy research. They might have the heart, they might come in saying we want to make change, but that's a lot to put on a brand new volunteer school board member who's also working on 1,000 other issues. So at NARAL Pro Choice Oregon, we created this caucus not only to be able to let people connect to one another, to build power and resource sharing, but to offer the kind of internal support so that people could come to us and say, there's going to be a vote in Hillsborough, turn your people out. There's going to be a vote in Westland-Wilsonville. We saw this in Westland-Wilsonville where the mic was opened when they were reaffirming their comprehensive sex ed curriculum, and the people that turned out were saying vile, disgusting things against sex ed, and yet the people that we turned out to speak were not only legislators and representatives, but were parents, were young people talking about the bullying and harassment that they saw in their schools, LGBT youth, people who knew that sex ed was important. And so it's been really inspiring to watch. It's been, I think, a new level of grassroots organizing that's often forgotten as we focus on the statewide and the legislature. But we know that this is not only key to access for our students and who are disproportionately impacted, especially in communities where there isn't reproductive health access, where they're not getting sex ed, but also if we build a pipeline. And I think that's really key. And just like Anne and Christel were talking about, we've been investing in school board races that center candidates of color, that center women, that center people who have historically, I think, been barred from electoral office. And we're 2 years in now, and I think seeing a real impact. So we would love to talk to you more about this work specifically in Hillsborough.
And I think a lot of that is also relationship building, right? And so the endorsement process is a process of relationship building, and I think that relationship building with trusted organizations and also be able to connect them with other school board members. And so that is a huge part of it for us. And I think that's, again, the transformational rather than transactional model that I think we're trying to build more and more into the way that we engage in politics.
Hi, I'm Tanya Shire with Ruffin County. I've been marching and fighting for reproductive rights since I had my abortion in 73. And I really hoped that this fight would be over. I am so proud of the young women sitting on that panel, and you do my heart proud. Thank you.
As long as they want to put up this fight, there will always be folks of color and women uniting to actually do this work. We will always be here fighting for this, and I think we'll be teaching the next generation. I think one of my favorite quotes ever was from a guy named Roland, who said specifically about communities of color fighting for all the things we fight for now, right? We will fight until the world freezes over, and then we'll fight on the ice.